Hello, everybody. You're very warmly welcomed to our webinar this afternoon. Here, that is, in Northern Ireland. We're very conscious that there are people joining us from across the world. So wherever you are, you're very warmly welcomed to this special webinar on trauma, healing and reconciliation, which is the first of a series of webinars organised by Cooperation Ireland as part of the Our Generation programme. So it's lovely to have everybody here. We have probably something like 170 people joining us from across Britain and Ireland, but also further afield in the United States and also Europe and further afield. And we're very conscious at the moment, of course, of events unfolding in Ukraine. And I know many of our minds will be on the situation there, and also we may know people living there or from there. We're also mindful that whilst we are thinking very much about Ukraine, there are other areas of conflict going on in the world. And so it's with them, the people living in those conflict zones, that perhaps we pay particular attention to the events, to this program and this webinar. Just a little bit of a word about how we tend to proceed. I'll say something about myself in the first instance. My name is David Bolton. I live in Northern Ireland. I used to work in the health and social services and also in the not-for-profit sector for roughly about 40 years. And my work over those 40 years has predominantly involved working with people affected by the conflict here in Northern Ireland. And that has involved things like, as a social worker, evacuating villages and other places when there were bomb scares or when bombs had gone off, through to planning for events, through some major emergencies and atrocities, for example, the Enniskillen and Omagh bombings, and then in more recent years, the establishment of trauma services to address the psychological impact of the violence. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on if we've got time towards the end of the program. But just to say to you that we hope to have questions and answers later on at the end of each of our speakers. So if you have a question that pops into your mind, please put it into the Q&A box and we pick those up at the end of each contribution. However, I'm very pleased to welcome our three speakers for today: Dr. Karen Treisman, Christophe Mbonyingabo, and Dr. Rosie Burroughs, who will each speak for roughly about 20 minutes and share some insights into the field of trauma and reconciliation. And of course, one of our themes for today is also looking at the transgenerational effects of trauma as well. So we want to make sure we pick that one up as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Karen Treisman. Karen is a highly specialist clinical psychologist and organizational consultant who has worked in the NHS and children's services for several years. And she is well known as a contributor to these kind of events. And I very much look forward to hearing what she's got to say. So Karen, you're most welcome, and over to you.
Thanks so much, and thank you for the lovely, useful introduction and for having me part of the training today. It's a really tricky task to talk about a complex, multi-layered area in 20 minutes. So what I'm going to do is just context set and just really talk about some of the different types of trauma, because trauma is such a broad umbrella term. And often when people say I'm trauma informed, what does that actually mean or look like, and what do they mean by the type of trauma? So just before, I'm going to go faster than usual, but just to give a sense, given we're about to spend a couple of hours talking about trauma, it's so important in the context of the pandemic, in Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, what's happening in Syria, Ukraine, Sarah Everett murder, so much that is happening, and the work that we do that is complex and multi-layered. There can be so much emotional contagion, moral injury. There can be that wound. That can be so much that people have to hold or make sense. And sometimes in this work, particularly in social care, we can do self-sacrifice instead of self-care. One of my projects in Kenya talks about well-being leads to well-doing. How can you be there for others without leaving yourself behind? And we know we can only meet others as deeply as we've met ourselves. And so I think before I dive into talking about trauma, please make yourself as cozy and comfy as possible. Do whatever you need to be regulated and grounded. It's hard to be mindful when our minds are full. And I hope you will take a moment to think, what do you need? What do you have? What do you want? Because you are the greatest strategy and tool. Maya Angelou says, it's not what we say, it's not what we do, it's how we make people feel. We are not people's final destination, but how do we leave a heartprint, a footprint in people's journeys? So I'm going to talk quite quickly about complex, painful, powerful, emotive stuff. So I just wanted to start with that grounding and rooting. And I'm so aware that at the moment in the emotional contagion, that so many people might have their brains have too many tabs open. So many people might be having that sense of their window of tolerance being narrower, overstretched, under-resourced, having to hold and make sense and process where work has been into home and home has been into work. So please be kind and nourishing to yourself. One of the biggest parts of trauma-informed practice is about our own grounding, our own regulation, our own well-being. So I'm going to just do a brief introduction to some of the different types of trauma, but I'm just going to do a bit of context setting and then I'll go into that a little bit more. So this is one of the most important parts of trauma. And sadly, people have become very reductionist. Trauma is post-traumatic stress disorder. Sexual abuse is worse than physical abuse, very hierarchical. Or trauma is this, that's not trauma. Especially when it's become such a everyday used, oh, I missed the bus, I'm traumatized. But what we know is same storm, different boat. And some people would say different storm. But when we say same storm, different boat, some people have been at sea for much longer. Some people have a hole in their boats. Some people have access to life-saving equipment or life vests. Some people are Olympic swimmers. Some people are tied by weights. Some people don't know how to swim. Some people have a past experience of almost drowning or a fear of water. Some people have been at sea for much longer or have bigger waves. When we say things like we're all traumatized, everyone has had a traumatizing 2 years in the pandemic, actually what that does is feed into this, there's them and us, there's othering, there's polarization. You should, toxic positivity. There is a right way to be. Not we all. Some people have had the most gorgeous 2 years. Some people have had a really tricky, dysregulating 2 years. And many people have been on the corona coaster, the ups, the downs, the blends. And it's very similar when we talk about trauma. I'm going to show you some categories, but that's what they are. They're Western socially constructed categories. Take sexual abuse as an example. It's a Western socially constructed category. Some people, it might be very useful category. Other people might not see what they experience as abuse or might not use that term. But I could take 10 children who have experienced sexual abuse within social care, but I don't have an emotional X-ray. Each one of those children, even if they're in the same family, they are a unique individual within a unique context, within a unique culture. What's their meaning making and sense making? What's their age and stage, not just chronologically, but socially, emotionally, and developmentally? What was the impact, the frequency? What was their relationship like with that person? What have been some of the conceptualizations or attributions? There isn't a cookie cutter approach. Trauma happens in context, not in a vacuum. It's nuanced. And when we talk about things sometimes like dissociation, What is dissociation? You could have 100 people who show it in utterly different ways. And when we think about something like, I'll give you a couple of examples in the trauma world, the word survivor versus victim. Some people love the word survivor, not victim. Some people victim, not survivor. Some don't use either. Some use both, I don't mind. Some depends on the context or the person who's saying it, or have a different term. There is no right or wrong. We need to honor the person's lived and living experience, that they are a unique individual. And it's the same as same storm, different boat, that one person might experience bullying and it's water off a duck's back. Another person experiences bullying and it's very distressing for a transient period. And another person, it leaves an absolute imprint, heartprint, permeates throughout their life as those ghosts of the past, sends them down a chain of pain. We need to be really honoring of that. So I just wanted to start, and I could give loads more examples, but I won't in terms of the time. So I just want to say a few teeny tiny bits without going into it too much before I show you the different types of trauma. Not everyone that experiences trauma would label it or view or see it as a trauma. And trauma is not a pathologizing, medicalizing term. The trauma-informed shift is, it's not what is wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. It's not what is the matter with you, but what matters to you. And it's not what is wrong with you, it's what is strong with you. Just because people have experienced trauma, each person's impact, how it might show itself, how they might present, the signals, the experiences might be utterly different. And that's the same as if you have 3 children in the same family. We do not assume or pathologize trauma or human distress. But you also can't talk about trauma without talking about adversarial growth, adversity activated development, survivorship, hope. How can we be hopeful bearers, hopeful sharers, hopeful disruptors? People do not need to be defined by trauma. People are more than trauma. And you can have both and at the same time. You can be in a place of struggling and trauma and distress and have amazing survivorship and adversarial growth. It's not one or the other. But so much of trauma is also connecting with the hope. How can we be hopeful bearers, hopeful sharers, hopeful disruptors? Now, trauma is one part of the puzzle, and trauma is a very broad term. We have to hold all of those lenses around child and adolescent development, around culture. Culture is like oxygen, it's everywhere, even if you can't see it. Around neurodiversity, around additional learning needs. Trauma is just one part of the puzzle. And the last thing I'm going to say before we go into the different types is you don't need to know the ins and outs and nuts and bolts of someone's trauma. Actually, sometimes that can re-traumatize or be trauma-inducing to ask graphic details and can sometimes come from a morbid curiosity. We need to be curious instead of furious. We need to see who is the person behind the behavior, and we need to honor what that person is experiencing. It's not the event itself. It's the meaning making and the sense making. Gabor Mate says, trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside of you. If the body could talk, what would it say? If the behavior could talk, what would it say? You don't need to know the ins and outs of what someone's experienced to be able to support or have empathy or be curious. And so often what we know is trauma is the elephant in the room. But unlike when someone's got a broken arm or they're in a wheelchair or they've got Down syndrome, we can see, we don't know what that's like, but we can visibly see. But trauma so often is avoided, minimized, camouflaged, masked. We see the self-harming, we see the drugs and alcohol, we see the multiple school exclusion. But so often we don't see the hurt or the pain. And that's not just for people we work with, for our friends, for our family, for our colleagues. So how do we walk gently in the lives of others? Trauma so often is masked, is camouflaged. So when we talk about trauma and people say, well, how does trauma look? Or what's the definition of trauma? It doesn't make sense, that question. I'm trauma informed. What does that mean? Because trauma is an umbrella term. Trauma comes from the Greek word, which means traumata, to wound or to pierce. It can pierce through individual, family, organizational, societal layers, pierce the fabric. But it can also be a moral injury, a physical injury, a relational injury. And again, all of these different traumas, some of them we might see and know about, and many might be silenced or camouflaged or masked or unseen. And so many people that we might work with and ourselves, because there's no us and them, it might be layered or interlinked or interwoven, a cumulative impact. But each of these are not just a term, each of them will have different meaning making, different sense making, all the nuances. And we can have multiple ones at the same time. This is by no means all the types of trauma. Please don't think it is, but this is just a summary of some of the different types of trauma. And I'm just going to pick up on a few of them in the next 10 minutes that we have. There is relational attachment and interpersonal trauma. That is trauma that's occurred within your relationships, by your relationships, that's likely to impact how you do relationships, how you are in relationships, and what you might expect from relationships. Relational trauma requires relational repair. Relational trauma requires relational healing. And that includes what is often called emotional neglect, which I call relational poverty, relational starvation, being in an emotional desert. There is developmental trauma, trauma that has occurred during childhood, including pregnancy, the in utero period, a baby's first classroom, a baby's first lesson into life, into relationships. It's trauma that might derail or influence or impact a child's development. Either we might see global developmental delay, we might see it in a particular domain like speech and language or sensory integration, or we might see that someone, either an adult, for example, might be 35 chronologically, but socially, emotionally, and developmentally, when they're feeling scared or unsafe, go down a memory time hole to being a much younger stage, or a child who might go into that pseudo-independence. We have abuse and maltreatment across the lifespan, including our older adult population, cradle to grave, womb to tomb. We have cultural, racial, identity trauma. I do a 5-day training on that one around racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and so forth. But it's also about microaggressions, macroaggressions, social exclusion, stigma, discrimination, othering, inequalities. There's intergenerational and historical and sometimes called inherited trauma, huge in this context. That in essence often refers to two branches. One is more within and through the family. They often say what we don't repair, we can repeat. How we can see that chain of pain pass through and within families, where there might be a script or a theme or a narrative of criminality, drugs and alcohol, domestic abuse that can pass through and within the family, through scripts, through patterns, through themes, psychologically and systemically. And that also refers to the study of epigenetics. Epigenetics is how, for some people, not everyone, their DNA sequencing can be adapted or changed depending biologically what happened to parents and grandparents. So, for example, my grandparents who were survivors of the concentration camps and of the Holocaust, they have looked at second and third generation survivors, and they have found that for the parents and grandchildren, the second and third generation, for some people, they are more likely to have changes in their digestive systems, be underweight or overweight, but also more likely to have things like Crohn's, colitis, celiac, also have more of a propensity for eating disorders, both things like anorexia, bulimia, and obesity. The other part of intergenerational inherited and historical trauma is that chain of pain that can be passed through and within the generations from collective societal events, things like the Troubles, the Holocaust, slavery, colonization, how those things can shape, influence the ghosts of the past and the angels of the past, the intergenerational trauma and the intergenerational wisdom. There is single event trauma that is a one-off, a car accident, a sexual assault. And all of your interventions and models and theories would be different for these different things. I'm just going to pick a couple more and I'll say one more slide and I will bring to an end. Medical injury and birth trauma. That can include disability trauma. That's anything to do with health, hospitals, well-being. That could be the shock of having a heart attack. That could be from a significant burn, going through fertility treatment, having a miscarriage, a stillborn baby, a traumatic birth, having a cleft lip and palate, being on a respirator during COVID, having a significant injury. That could be having a traumatic experience with a hospital or treatment, HIV, female genital mutilation, or amputations, all sorts. There's traumatic grief, bereavement, and loss. And you can't talk about trauma without talking about grief and loss. That's not just grief and loss from death, suicide, murder, manslaughter, but that's, for example, in the context of sexual abuse, could be the grief or loss of one's innocence, childhood, body boundaries, integrity. Trauma is an integrity boundary violation. It could be the loss of one's trust, safety, hope. For our children in foster care or asylum seeking, the loss of everything that they know, from the smells, from the sounds. It could be that disfranchised grief. Disfranchised grief is socially unacknowledged, invalidated grief, such as our parents who have their children removed by social services and yet so often are demonized, vilified, stigmatized, have constant reminders. And of course, there's much others like anticipatory grief. Last couple I'm going to say, or last few. Community trauma is trauma that can permeate the fabric of a community, like the Troubles, like Grenfell Towers, like a community of fear or extreme poverty, how it can shape that almost emotional contagion, traumatic fog, traumatic air way of being. And I'll just say those last two because I'm mindful of time. There's organizational, system and institutional trauma. I've got books about that. Organizational trauma is when the organization itself, like a school, a prison, local authority, becomes traumatized and traumatizing. The organization itself is unhealthy, has a compromised immune system. The organization itself is in toxic stress. System trauma is the trauma that our systems add, reinforce, or create for people, where our systems are trauma-inducing instead of trauma-reducing. For example, 2-year waiting lists, or when someone is pathologized after years of abuse by being told they have a personality disorder, or someone who is raped and feels re-raped by the court system, or someone who has to retell their graphic stories, or going from service to service like a human pinball, or the language that is used, system trauma. And institutional trauma is the It's the trauma that can be occurred within and by institutions, either whether that's in a religious institution, a sport, a health, the trauma itself, the institutional betrayal, but also institutional racism, ageism, homophobia, and so forth. And last, but by no means least, and there's many beyond this, is secondary and vicarious trauma, compassionate fatigue or burnout. That is how we can experience trauma indirectly. If we are marinated and soaked in other people's distress or trauma, that cost of caring, how foster carers or adopters can experience that, being marinated in hurt children, or if your partner, or being a therapist or social worker, being soaked and marinated in it. Rachel Remens says the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss on a daily basis and not be impacted by it is as unrealistic as thinking we can walk through water and not get wet. The cost of caring. I hope, I've got a couple more slides, but I'm mindful of time, so I won't go through those. I hope that's a lot of information, but set the context for when we talk about I'm trauma informed, or what does trauma look like, or what is that we can hold in mind the umbrella term, and not just what these terms are, but same storm, different boat, the meaning making, the sense making, the accumulation, the layering, what might be seen or unseen, and that it's not them and us. How many people in services have experienced these themselves, both and. And when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, which there's lots of things that we could deconstruct about that, it's as important to think about adverse adult experiences, adverse community experiences, adverse organizational experiences, and adverse cultural experiences. I hope I've planted some seeds, done a bit of context setting. Thank you so much for listening, and I will be quiet now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. You delivered a huge amount of content for us and really set the context for what is to follow. So thank you very much for that. And I suppose one of the things I was particularly interested in your remarks was your cautioning against a one-size-fits-all, the cookie-cutter approach to trauma, and understanding it from the meaning that it has for the individual. And I suppose, to put it another way, 10 people could have the identical experience, but 10 people could make 10 different things of it. And you were more or less making that point. I liked your use of the phrase sense making. And could you say a little bit more about what you mean by sense making, the sense that we make of traumatic experiences?
Yeah, so there's so many different layers and nuances, but I suppose it is that sense of see a situation differently and you see a different situation, see a person differently and you see a different person. So it fits with what I said about Gabor Mate's. It's not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you. Someone, for example, who experiences sexual abuse, it's not the event itself, but it's how they understand what that is, why that might have happened, what some of the narratives about that, what some of the beliefs, the scripts that they might make sense of, what the impact or frequency, what explanations, what does that look like in their family context or their cultural context? How do they make sense of the relationship? So much of it is not the event itself, but how someone thinks, conceptualizes, interprets some of the different discourses and narratives around why me, or what happened, or what does this mean, or what does this look like. That's the important bit, not so much what I might see, but what might give weight or be important or be significant to me might be utterly different to someone else, or what is particularly poignant. So yeah, it's much more honoring the person's experience.
Yes. So in other words, it's right that we say that we should not say that everybody who's had this type of experience will automatically be traumatized by that experience. That would be an incorrect approach to take, and that's particularly relevant, I think, around mass experiences of trauma and the development of services in response to community needs.
And anyone who starts to do things like sticking really closely to the ACE questionnaire or a tick box or a checklist absolutely is a red flag, because we know that people experience make sense differently. And there's so many factors that go into that, from the cultural context, the family context, what else has happened, were they believed, the protective factors, when it might come out. So absolutely, and particularly, as you say, community and collective, and there can be communal mourning and grieving, and it's the same as something like resilience. I'm not a big fan of that word, but one person will see someone just being fine as being resilient, another person will see that they're dissociating, another person will see them as strong, another person will see that as actually they're just saying I'm fine and it's toxic positivity. There's no checklist, or it's messy and muddy and evolving and dynamic.
I suppose one of the things that strikes me is that the individual who seems to cope very well cognitively and emotionally, but their body starts to give problems. And that's a kind of a very good example of how one size doesn't fit all. And in fact, they may have very significant and long-term physical reactions to their experiences. And they themselves may not make the connections, which is the other thing.
Absolutely. As Bessel van der Kolk says, the body holds the score. Or as I say, if your body could talk, what would it say?
Yes. You cautioned us against the overworked use of trauma, the word trauma itself. And I wonder, do you think it'd be better if we actually almost ban the word unless we want to mean it in a particular way? Instead, we talk about traumatic experiences and traumatic consequences. Is that not a more accurate way of using the word trauma?
I actually think trauma can be a really helpful word to use, because I think it can actually name it to tame it, as Dan Siegel says. I think because it so often has been camouflaged or stigmatized or not acknowledged, it can be incredibly helpful. But I am always one to think about what that person wants to use. Is that adversity? Is that difficult life experiences? Is that stressors? Is that paths of recovery? Is there, so to me, I think it's defining what type of trauma that might be, rather than the umbrella. Is it medical trauma? Is it intergenerational? Is it mixed? But then really having that discussion with people about what word fits or sits or resonates for you. Again, context is important. Social care, we need to talk about trauma and we need people to understand and have that acknowledged. But whereas sometimes in schools, for example, they might prefer talking about healing or stressors or relationship based. So there's lots of complexities around that one. But I do think it's important. The other reason it's important to use the word trauma is you need to then have the knowledge about trauma. You need to go and read about trauma, understand the theories, models. If we took trauma away, it loses the guide of the knowledge base that people need.
Yeah, I think that's very important indeed, absolutely. Well, thank you very much indeed for a very rich and colourful presentation with lots of content for us to think about. And a few of the questions that have been coming up have been about, will people have access to the notes and so on. So I can see that the session's been recorded and will be available to participants hereafter. So if you haven't been able to get all of the detail down of any of the presentations, then you can look back on the recording that'll be shared later on. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to Christophe. So thank you very much indeed, Karen, for all you've done and for the work you've put into today's presentation. And thank you for getting us off to a flying start.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye. Okay. Happy weekend.
Thank you now. Hi, Christophe. You're most welcome. Lovely to have you with us. And just by way of introduction, you're the founder and executive director of CARSA, which is the Christian Action for Reconciliation and Social Assistance. An interesting title indeed, in Rwanda. It's a non-profit organization founded to contribute to the restoration and development of the nation of Rwanda. And since its creation in 2002, CARSA has transformed the lives of many communities through trauma healing and reconciliation workshops, peace education, training in children's ministry, and community empowerment. So that's a tremendously rich array of inputs that you're providing. So, Christophe, you're most welcome. And just to ask you the question, are you speaking to us today from Rwanda?
Yes, thank you very much, David. And hi, everyone. I'm speaking from Rwanda. That's where I live.
It's lovely.
And Shen has got some of my recording. I don't know how they want this to happen, if they want to use the pre-recording or they want me to speak. So I don't know exactly what the plan is right now.
I think maybe if you're happy, we'll run with your presentation and then you can pick up questions and issues at the end. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure.
Good. And you did the clever thing. You got the presentation out of the way by recording it in advance.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I can then speak. Thank you very much.
That's good. Okay, we look forward to hearing what you got to say, and then we'll take any issues then that arise thereafter.
Good. Growing up, I knew nothing about mental health. I knew nothing about trauma. I had never experienced any violence. And I had never seen any human killing another human for no reason. Until when the genocide occurred in Rwanda in 1994, where within 100 days, a million people were killed and killed by their neighbors. As any other violence, the genocide was so bad in many, many ways. Number one, the genocide was organized by the government, it was executed by local people, militias, where neighbors had killed their neighbors, family members had killed their family members. We had even where husbands had killed their own wives, where we had intermarriage. But secondly, the speed and the brutality that's happened during the genocide. You can imagine that 11,000 people were being killed within a single day. But thirdly, how rape was used as another weapon. After the genocide, studies show that between 1,100 to 150,000 people were raped. And after the genocide, life was very difficult for so many people in Rwanda, especially from genocide survivors, those who had lost their beloved one, those who had experienced and seen how their family members, husband or wife, or children or parents had been killed, but those who had also gone through that tragedy, where they had been hidden here and there, and they survived but with huge trauma. But on the other hand, perpetrators who were involved in genocide, they also had their own issues, because after the genocide, about 2 million people had fled Rwanda, and they went to the neighboring countries where they experienced horrible things, especially the DRC and other parts in the region where also they suffered a lot. And when the genocide was stopped by the RPF and a new government was established, the government had to find a way to reconstruct and rebuild the nation. And that's how they chose a path which was very difficult, a path of reconciling, reuniting, and rebuilding a nation where all the groups would feel accepted, would feel that they belong to the same country. But that was a very difficult thing to do by the government, because not only so many people had died, not only many infrastructures had been destroyed, but especially the level of trauma was so high. You can imagine women who had been raped during the genocide. You can imagine those who had physical wounds, but also psychological. You can imagine children, orphans, who had seen how their parents had been killed. The level of trauma was high. And that's why the government of Rwanda, after 1994, decided to establish a National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, which had the mandate to really focus, encourage, and coordinate all the initiatives that were in the line of trauma healing and reconciliation. And many civil society organizations, including churches, were also involved in the work of trauma healing and reconciliation, trying to assist those people who really had experienced the horrible thing any human can experience. It is from that same line that CARSA, Christian Action for Reconciliation and Social Assistance, was started with the mission to support the journey of communities in Rwanda towards trauma healing, forgiveness, reconciliation, and holistic development. And for the last over 18 years, CARSA has been involved in a few programs. Number one, the first program that CARSA has been working is what we call the trauma healing and reconciliation. CARSA has been working with genocide survivors and genocide perpetrators because after the genocide, the government decided to use a restorative justice system that allowed the perpetrators to come out of the prison and were judged from the communities. And those who were remorseful, those who were repentant, and who had accepted their involvement in the genocide were released, and they came live side by side with their victims. And so CARSA go in the communities and bring together those two groups, genocide survivors and the genocide perpetrators, what we call the direct perpetrator, meaning the person who had been involved in one way or the other to kill or to steal or any other evil thing to this other perpetrator. This we call the direct survivor and perpetrator. Those are the people we invite, and we have 7-day workshop where we work alongside these people with different topics, including understanding trauma, including repentance, forgiveness, including how to deal with the past, how to move forward but together, and other topics through identity and so on. And after the workshop, these people are sent back in their communities to start what we call reconciliation small groups. And within this group, that is where the journey that has started from the workshop will continue. And through those small groups, CARSA has other programs. One of them is what is called a community empowerment or economic empowerment, especially with our unique program called the Cow for Peace. And the Cow for Peace, which in your context, on your accent, you call the Kai, but it's a cow to milk. CARSA provides a cow, which is shared by the two people, like survivor and perpetrator, as a way of reconnecting them. The cow becomes a bridge to allow these two people to interact on daily basis, but also allow their family, for those who have families, to truly get involved in the journey, in the process, as they raise the cow together. Number one, when the cow is given to these two people, it's fed at the survivor's home, and the perpetrator has the responsibility to come on a daily basis to help the survivor to feed the cow. And when the cow is sick, they work together to find a way to treat the cow. And when the cow has the calf and they start producing milk, they share the milk. And because most of the survivors in Rwanda are female, and in our context, not so many women will milk the cow, then the survivor, the genocide perpetrator, will come, help the survivor to milk the cow on every day. And then this allows them to really dig deep in their journey of forgiveness and reconciliation. Secondly, the cow becomes a witness, a clear sign from these two people who used to be seen from the community as enemies. But because of sharing the cow, the neighbors, the community members see that this journey is real, that the forgiveness is real, because they see them sharing the cow and the milk. But thirdly, the cow becomes a tool to truly engage these people toward restoring their broken trust. Why I'm saying that? Now the perpetrator is coming to milk the cow, or the survivor milk the cow and share the milk with the offender, the perpetrator. And the perpetrator drink the milk without fear of maybe being poisoned by the survivor. And the other way around, when the perpetrator is milking the cow and gives the milk to the survivor is not afraid to be poisoned by the perpetrator. Now the cow is helping them to restore the trust. And this program, the Cow for Peace, has been very unique because it also embodied the cultural context within it. Because the cow in our context, in our culture, it's really a meaningful animal. And the other program we have is what we call peace education for the young people. Remember that now it's about 28 years after genocide. We have a whole generation of young people who were born after genocide, who did not witness the genocide, but the second generation. These people, these young people, have seen how, have been experiencing how their parents are struggling, either from the survivor, the perpetrator, to get out of their pain and the trauma, but also to reconcile. And also, they are learning from their parents. And among these young people, we have a unique group of young people who were born out of genocide. We work with their mothers because this is a very unique group of people. But at the same time, we work with these children who are struggling to know their identity because they know their mothers, but they don't know their father. It's hard for their mother because of the deep of the trauma they have experienced to even be open up to share and explain to their children how they were born. So these are the young people we work with. And for these past years, working with these post-genocide communities, we've learned a few lessons that I'll share with you. Number one, even though people might have traumatizing deep level, but when there is attention and intentionality, trauma healing is possible. Number two, repentance and forgiveness plays an important role in providing and enhancing trauma healing. Why? Because when you've been harmed by someone, when you've experienced any violence from someone, what happened to you is like poison injected within you. Now, when you are able to forgive, it's like bringing out that poison, which might kill you for a long time if you don't deal with it. And I know this is a huge topic because people ask so many questions. So how can you forgive someone who did not ask for forgiveness? How can you this A and B? But the reality and the fact of it is that when the survivor is able to forgive, it contributes to the healing. And thirdly, cultural context plays an important role in the trauma healing. In our experience, the cow that I've explained to you helps a lot because it engages these two people, allows them to really have a meaningful conversation as they raise the cow together. This is a cultural aspect. And this is matters because even though the concept of trauma healing is broad, but it has to be contextualized where cultures plays an important role. And finally, this is a multi, I would call it a sort of like cross-cutting aspect. You need to tackle not only the trauma that's the person has experienced, but also thinking about the other things around the person, which might also contribute to the healing. For instance, if someone is dealing with poverty, if someone has lost the house and doesn't have a house, as much as you can help the person to get healed through different approaches, but if you don't support the person to have a house, then the healing will not be complete. It has to be holistic. Include the social, the psychological, the spiritual, as well as the economic aspect. We've seen that's contributing much to the trauma healing. As I finish, I want to share with you a video that gives you some stories of what happened as cancer has been working with genocide survivors and perpetrators. Thank you very much.
ubuzima bwacu bwa buri munsi duhuriramo na byinshi bimwe bikadutera ibyishimo tukishima cyane gusa hakabaho n'ibidutera umujinya agahinda no kwiheba bikabije iyo umuntu wawe apfuye urababara cyane, ariko se warakarira bingana iki umuntu wagize uruhare mu ipfa ry'umuryango wawe?
imyaka rero bankatiye n'ubundi iyo nza kuba ndi mukuru yari kureba ko ni ukuvuga ngo bamfashe mu bamineri bakoze nyine bakoze jenoside nyine bakiri batoya.
Ni ukuvuga tumeranye, mbega naramubwiye nti wowe, mbega yaje kusuza namubwira nti reka nkubwire wowe, naba nsa neza naba ntasa neza, imihanda ni ibiri, hari iburyo hari n'ibumoso, nubona naciye ibumoso uzaca hariya, sinzakuvugisha ntuzamvugisha, ujye uca hariya ntukansuhuze, ubu ni uko tubanye.
Nta mugabo ngira, nta mugabo wacu, nta mukeba wanjye, nta mwisengeneza, bose bagiye jenoside. Napfushije abantu barenga 50. Numvaga ntamubabarira.
Ikibazo nari mfite ni uko numvaga aho nahurira nabo ni kugita nanyohiga nabonana nabo, namubona ari nko mu nzira wenda rero hari nk'ahantu tugiye guhurira nka muri kamera kabanza ngende.
Muri jenoside yabaye mu Rwanda hari umusaza witwaga Apolinari twari duturanye, ubwo nagiye mu gitero umusanga ahantu yari yihishe mu bishyimbo, bamukubita inkoni nyinshi.
Yaje kuvuga yuko ari we yagize uruhare mu kwica umusaza ari we papa witwa Ntagozera Apolinari.
Mu mahugurwa nasobanuriwe neza imitwaro nikoreye, mbasha gusobanurirwa n'icyaha nakoze icyo ari cyo, ndagusaba imbabazi umuntu nahemukiye, nzisaba n'Imana n'Abanyarwanda muri rusange, nawe arazimpa, numva ndabohotse.
Batwigishije guheka ibikapu, aribyo byari bindi, kwizirikaho umuntu ukihobohokanya nawe. N'ubu rero nagendaga nkururukana nawe, Silivera hondi mu murima, mu masengesho, ako karisi maze kunyigisha, maze kwiga ukuntu bakira ibikomere, kwiga ukuntu umuntu agira atanga imbabazi, maze kumva uko nakwiremamo icyizere, ubwo ngubwo numva noneho birushijeho. Rero ubwo maze kumubabarira nibwo twatangiye urugendo rw'ibikorwa byo gufatanya.
Christophe n'abandi bari kumwe babanjije twereka batugereranyiriza ko ibyaha dufite tugomba kuba twabitura Yesu Kristo ku musaraba.
Numvaga ubundi Nyandwi ntamubabarira, ariko yansabye imbabazi yikubise hasi ndege ukuntu apfukamye, noneho arapfukama mu bantu mu mbaga nyamwinshi, aho twari turi mu mahugurwa, yifata bigasaba imbabazi, avuga uburyo yamwishe, ambwira ati mbabarira. Kumubabarira byaratinze, byambereye ikibazo. Kumubabarira byambereye ikibazo, nanjye nahamutse icyo gihe, nikubita hasi ngo ingazi bita ku ntebe, ubwo niciye gutya barampungiza. Wumva byumva nyine narize ibyo kurira bivaho, ndarira amarira araza, bigeze aho ngaho arakama, amarira arakama, numva rwose byari byo kurira, numva bicogoye biragiye, numva biragiye. Ndangije numva mfite umutima w'imbabazi.
Nyamara uyu munsi Banyarwanda turashima Kristo Yesu Umukiza, akomeje gukiza imitima yakomeretse.
Inka y'ubwiyunge rero ni inka dutanga, imwe igafatanya uwacitse ku icumu n'uwamuhemukiye, bagafatanya kuyitaho no kuyiragira bayisangiye, nk'uburyo bubafasha gukomeza rwa rugendo rwatangiye amahugurwa rw'urugendo rw'ubwiyunge, rubateza imbere kugira ngo bashobore kugira impamvu ituma bahura buri munsi, bafite uko basangira baganira, ariko n'imiryango yabo yinjire muri iyo gahunda.
Iriya nka baduhaye iyo nyibonye ngewe hari ubwo inyibutsa n'ibyabaye muri iki gihugu, ariko noneho tukagaruka none nkavuga ni leta y'ubumwe bw'abanyarwanda, izindi mbabazi nahawe, imbabazi ziri hano mu rugo ku buryo nashobora kongera kugwa mu cyaha.
Imbabazi ni ubushobozi bukuzamo bugatuma ubona uwaguhemukiye mu yindi shusho nziza atari ya yindi mbi wamukekagaho.
Well, thank you very much, Christophe, indeed, for your presentation to us and indeed for that film. And I must say, it's a remarkable account of what you have been doing, but also of the transformation that's taking place in your country. And I have no doubt that it has come at a great cost and with a great challenge to you and to your fellow country people. But I think you have much to teach us here in Northern Ireland, where we have not gone as far as you have in embracing all who have needs. And I'm very humbled listening to what you have to say. We are an agricultural community here. Much of our landscape is given over to farming, and we have many cows, but we don't have a lot of peace of heart. And I will look at cows in a new way as a symbol of forgiveness, of being forgiven. And it really is remarkable. And one of your contributors said, to forgive him took a long time and cost me a lot. And it just makes the point that forgiveness isn't cheap. It's very, very tough. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. That's remarkable. And it reminded me of meeting a delegation of your fellow countrymen who came to Belfast to find out about the troubles here and trying to learn from us. And when I met them and heard their stories, I could hardly speak and certainly felt I had nothing to share that was of any worth because you had journeyed so far ahead of us. So thank you. And we have one question, Christophe, here, and I wonder if you could address it for us, please, because it is relevant to our subject today. What issues are children and young people facing now in Rwanda? And how do you manage their intergenerational trauma? And in fact, maybe another question there is, can you see evidence of an intergenerational trauma and what does that look like?
Thank you, David. Yes, what do we see from young people? What happened during the genocide, for those who have gone through it, for those who have witnessed and experienced it, it's so deep that sometimes, despite of the step they might have taken towards trauma healing, towards forgiveness and reconciliation, it's still difficult for some of the parents to sit down and be open to their children and share with them in detail about what they experienced. Because young people are curious to understand how even that happened, because they were born and grew up in different contexts, situation and all that. They have had even to understand how that happened. And so what we do is that we invite people and we invite parents to have conversation where parents will be encouraged to share with the young people of how life used to be prior to the genocide, during the genocide, and genocide, to help young people to deal with the confusion they really have about all these narratives. But secondly, young people also have the challenge to connect the individual story from their parents to the general narrative of the country. Because even though the genocide happened on country scale, but each individual who have gone through it has a unique story. So then when children go to school and they learn the history, they learn about all what happened from the community, society, government narrative, sometimes they find difficult to connect to that general narrative, the individual family narrative. And so that's why the program as a peace education we invite government officials to come, help young people answer some of the questions their parents might not be able to answer. For instance, they might ask the question where these ethnic groups came from, because generally we don't have them. Like there's no differences. How did they have been created? Or like other general big questions that parents would be able to address, that government officials might address.
Yes.
And talking about the intergenerational trauma, yes, as the previous speaker mentioned that, it's very obvious to see how this second generation of people who were born out of parents who have gone through the genocide, it's very obvious that there is a tendency to already get and that trauma from their parents. Why? Because we can only give what we have. Yeah. If you have pain, if you have trauma, if you have this, it's normal as a parent to pass that even indirectly. One example, most survivors live alone. As we've seen the documentary, the lady said she had lost 50 relatives. And now the children will ask, why don't I have an uncle, an aunt, a grandpa, and others? So that question will trigger quickly the parents to tend to share the story. And the kid will not grasp every detail. She or he was not there. He or she will not understand everything. And then what knows it's like, it's the neighbors. I know I don't have an uncle because. So it's very obvious. That's the second generation is truly having that challenge of grasping and getting the trauma from their parents. And also there's some research that have proved that now the second generation of Rwandans are truly struggling, and there is a clear way and sign that the intergenerational trauma is occurred right now.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I suppose another question that occurs to me, because on one hand, it's good if young people can't remember and do move on and embrace life in a very positive way. But there's also, and we can see this here in Northern Ireland as well, there's a danger whereby young people may actually forget the reasons why the conflict happened, and there's a danger of new violence starting again because the younger generation haven't understood the cost of the conflict. And is that a problem with you, or do you think that your education programs help people to move beyond that point?
Yeah, I think I would say two things. One, there is this generational challenge or conflict, because with the old generation, which has gone through the genocide and all the challenges, they remember what they have seen, they remember what they have witnessed, they remember what they have experienced. And now we invite young people to join us and remember, but you cannot remember what you've never experienced. You cannot remember what you've never seen.
Yes.
So then how do we help young people to connect with that history, even though they have not even though they have not witnessed that, so that never again might be real in our context? And so that's why with all the genocide memorials that are in Rwanda, like from the peace education program, we take young people and they go with the genocide memorial, at least to get that sense and the clear picture of what happened.
Yeah, yeah.
They understand how evil that was. They understand like all the elements relating to the genocide, so that it's not just empty stories from part, but they can see and they can visit the genocide memorial to know.
Yes.
But also through every year in April, we have the whole week of commemorating the genocide. And 20 years after the genocide, we have whole young people, whole generation of young people, they're invited there so that they can also be part of the remembering, even though they were not there to witness. So they stand with their parents, they stand with the other people to really sympathize and be part of that, and knowing this is our history. We're not there, but this is our history. We have to remember so that this will not repeat again. So that's how I would say briefly it happens.
Yes, I thought that's very important, that, and because that link is made between what happened in the past and the forthcoming generations, but in a way that they remember the suffering, the loss, but also the price that's been paid for overcoming what was a terrible experience. One question that's arisen here is, do you have issues of addiction, alcohol or drugs? Is that a problem? And could I throw into that as well things like eating disorders, perhaps, or suicide risks? Are they a feature of the community that you live in? And could you say something about that, please?
Yes, thanks, David. Yeah, that's really a big challenge currently in Rwanda, because from our cultural background, things like alcoholic addiction was not part of our past, I would say.
Yes.
But now, if you see, it started from the rural area, I mean the urban areas, but now it's growing even the rural areas, where young people are really every day, the number is increasing from young people are being involved in alcoholism and addiction and drugs and all that. So we have now few centers established by the government to rehabilitate those young people. And now it's cross family. It's not only for my family or well, it's really a huge challenge. Eating disorder, not that much, especially because of probably not accessibility to all this, food like fast food and all that. I think it's not there. But suicide, I would tell you that it's the very first time, I would say, in our history that, I don't know if maybe it's now being recorded, but I can tell you that in the last years, we've seen of suicide. With the very first time in Rwanda, we've seen young people climbing the top and jump from the 6th floor coming down. That's quite new.
That's very sad.
So
really.
Again, very much. And so how do we connect it? There's still studies wondering where this comes from. Is it genocide? Is it connected to the other issues? But the reality, we've have some case where it's very sad. And now people are getting aware of trauma and depression and all that. Those are concepts that were not part of our history. But now it's more and more coming. And some people are wondering, is it really connected to the genocide? If it's connected to issues, but it's there, David.
Indeed.
It's there.
Yeah.
It's a sad thing.
Yes, it's just something that needs to be better understood, and I can understand your point there. Just on a final thought, you quite understandably and properly talked about the place of faith and religion in the work that you do. And in fact, it's very explicit, whereas here in Northern Ireland, we are increasingly moving in the direction of faith and religious practice being a private matter, and it's not talked about explicitly within public services, for example. How instrumental, how beneficial has it been for faith to be in the foreground of your work in that way that you described? And I'd be interested to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, David, it's sometimes from my learning experience and meeting people from different part of the world and different other contexts, especially from the Western context where faith and religious is being, pushed back and not even welcome, not even included in the social life. It's quite interesting to think and focus on the psychological part of human being and the physical part of human being, and completely ignoring the faith part of the human being.
Yes, yeah.
Because a human being has all those parts playing an important role in the way we see life, in the way we interact with people, in the way we live every day. It's not only psychological, it's not only economic and physical. Faith plays an important role, because we may believe it, we may know it or not, we still believe to something. Maybe we're not be able to describe. Maybe it's not God, the creator. Maybe it's not all those other God that's religious have portrayed, but every human believes to something. It's science or it's whatever. And so when you ignore that other aspect in this whole process of healing, trauma healing and forgiveness and whatever, for me, I think you are you are ignoring an important piece.
Yes, yes.
Because faith influences us directly or indirectly. And when we don't pay that attention, so we lose something. And from our context, with a background where we live in a community and society where religious Christianity, faith plays an important role, it has been very, very helpful.
Yes.
Some years back, we did a very rough study to see among all the civil society organizations that were involved in the work of trauma healing, reconciliation, peace building. And we did find out that all the organizations that were involved in the healing and the reconciliation had a sort of faith connection. Yes. While all the others, which did not have any faith aspect in their approach, they only focused on the peace building.
Yes, yeah.
And that was quite interesting.
Yeah.
Why? Because faith plays an important role when it comes to trauma healing, when it comes to reconciliation, because we engage with other people, and we cannot engage with other people from the human perspective, because there is the divine, there's the faith aspect, which plays an important role in all that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we leave faith out, we leave out a lot of the language, the metaphors, the means by which we can understand ourselves and our relationship with other people. And the idea of forgiveness is, of course, a deeply religious concept. And you know, it inevitably must, the language of faith must play a part in us trying to understand that. But listen, that's been a remarkable presentation. Thank you very much indeed. It's been most interesting and highly relevant, I think, to many of our participants. And we want to thank you very much. And would you please express our thanks to the people who were in the film, that they helped us understand things very, very well. I shall look at the cows in our fields in a completely different light from after today. And one last thing, if you'd send me an email afterwards and tell me where you buy your shirts, they're really quite remarkable.
Thank you, David. Thank you. I will do that.
Okay, Christophe.
Thank you.
Very good. Well, it's lovely to see you. Thank you, Christophe. All the best to you now.
Thank you very much.
Yes. So we're now going to turn to Dr. Rosie Burroughs. And Rosie, again, very warm welcome to you. Rosie is a consultant psychotherapist and award-winning practice researcher on practices of relational resilience, healing, transgenerational and developmental trauma. Rosie specializes in exploring thriving and surviving through trauma and loss working with individuals, couples, groups, communities and organizations at societal level, locally and internationally. So we're looking very much forward to hearing, Rosie, what you've got to say to us. That's a very interesting portrayal of your work and it's very stimulating. So hopefully now we'll get a better understanding of your work from what you have to say to us. And I'm not quite sure how we're doing this, Rosie. Are you going to share your screen with us, or is somebody else going to do that for us?
Someone else is going to do that. Brilliant.
Great.
Can we get it so that there's just one up at a time? Brilliant. Lovely. So I'm delighted to be here, and we've been taken in so much. I really enjoyed Karen and Christophe's presentation. It's really stirred me, and I wonder, could we just take a moment together as well in terms of, I think I'm so touched by what I've heard, to just let ourselves feel our feet on the ground and like take 30 seconds just to breathe, because we're in these big, big themes and they're probably resonating in some way with each of us. So just to give yourself that opportunity. Certainly if you're someone working on the ground, anywhere or on front lines, we all know that it's very challenging work to be a practitioner in working with trauma healing and reconciliation work. So let's just take this 1 minute. And if you like, you can close your eyes and feel your feet on the ground and just let yourself breathe. And notice how that is in the body to give ourselves that kind of, you could call it sacred space if we're on the theme of faith, regardless of what your faith is or your spirituality, to just sense the space inside you and how the breath is critical in the healing of trauma or reconciliation work. We all need to just let ourselves breathe and center and feel our feet in the ground. So thank you for that. So as David was saying, I'm a psychotherapist and a supervisor. I'm an old hand now. I think I'm becoming an elder in the community. I have been in the field for about 32 years, working in different roles in the community development, research on transgenerational trauma, and looking at what is it that we need to know as a community, as individuals, as couples, and as families. What are the skills that we need to know? And I have been involved in bringing various practices here, which would include practices like somatic experiencing. Now, what I've done as well is put photographs in this because I feel that nature is such an important resource for all of us, as well as poetry. So as part of the process, that we can use cultural resources in a way that support us to move out of what you might call survival defaults. Like, we'll all have them. You know, what do we do when we're under stress? You know, what are the traumas still within our own bodies that we're still processing? And this is a poem, and the background is the Belfast Hills, but it's from a Maori woman in New Zealand. And I just love it. It's something about giving the sense that we need to find an inner stillness in ourselves. We need to be able to rest and breathe, to recover and heal. And that way we can give so much more to the community. So can we move to the next one, please? So I know Karen didn't like the term resilience, and I totally get it. I totally understand why you wouldn't. That idea that you just bounce back and that there hasn't been an imprint or harm done, or, you know, loss and discrimination and all that we know that happens with trauma. But for me, it's almost the other side of trauma is resilience or healing. There's so many words we could use, but it's very important to me as a practitioner and researcher to hold on to this term as a way of looking at sensing in each of us what is our individual and collective capacity to hold on to ourselves, especially under stress. And that, of course, is also in relation to trauma, which we know in Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, we have had multi-generational trauma now that we've had our conflict, and then previous forms of poverty, all kinds of ways that we could explain the past, but all these different layers, as Karen was outlining. And I think a core concept that I want to put across is this importance of what is it that we can each do to hold on to ourselves in times of trouble, in times when we have been impacted by a traumatic event, and to ground ourselves in what I would call compassionate connection within ourselves, so that in a way that's part of the healing as an individual and as a collective, that if we can find that compassionate connection towards ourselves, which we know that many people here, you know, in this part of the world, as well as many parts of the world, if they've had traumatic experiences, it can be very hard for them to find self-compassion and to really find that resource within themselves. So I do want to emphasize that I find it very useful in my own practice, and the idea that we are working with good enough outer and inner conditions. And we know, of course, that there's times when that good enough conditions can go. They can, you know, all kinds of events can happen. And I thought Karen's presentation was really good about looking at the different forms of trauma that can happen. So, but how do we hold that as people who are interested in bringing about trauma healing and reconciliation? I find this an important way of looking at it, that kind of capacity to come back and work through, if we're lucky enough to have access to trauma healing. And I have been along with other people, of putting in place organizations here that are bringing new approaches in, like somatic experience, and which is a very body-based approach to working with trauma, and working as well on front lines of trauma. So can we go to the next slide, please? Now what I'm doing is deliberately using nature, because I feel for many of us that is a deep resource that we can get a healing experience from. And one definition that I really like, it's a very simple one, as we know there's many, many ways to look, as Karen has outlined, but trauma is literally a loss of our ground. We become overwhelmed. So if we can find the ways to rest and restore our boundaries and regenerate, that is something as a community that many of us here have been actively involved in, and ensuring that we can recognize resilience even in its many forms of, you know, where some people would be judging people. Instead, as practitioners, we're able to hold a non-judgmental approach and recognize that there's trauma adaptations within a field that has been violent, like we've had in the north of Ireland, and that we're recovering from, and that we're actively, many of us, engaged in. I mean, I feel very fortunate in a sense to have been here at a time when there was a whole musical movement, which meant that many young people here got together through music and actually tried to hold a space of safety and reconciliation through music. So one of the bands was called Big Self, and that term Big Self is actually what we need when we're tackling trauma within ourselves and collectively. And I know internal family systems will use this term, you know, self with a capital S. So if we can hold that within ourselves, we can really, really make a difference. And I feel very fortunate to have been part of that with other people. Can I have the next slide, please? I wonder, did we miss one there? But anyway, I love this. Someone did this for me. Is there one before that said 3 takeaways? No, okay, we'll stay with that. This is good. Okay, this here is what's called an infographic. And I've just discovered them, and it's an absolute joy as a presenter, you know, to discover this kind of way of presenting things. And I put this term up, and in a way I did this as part of a response to COVID, what was happening with COVID, and to look at the broader field. There's a societal field internationally in relation to that particular event, which was related, of course, to nature and what happened in terms of animals and human contact. So I want to say that in terms of context setting, I'm trying to put the work of trauma healing and reconciliation into a very broad brush that would include human to human, but also human to other than human. So we're including the earth and our relationship to the earth, because now we're actually, and I know there's going to be a later talk on climate, but I also in my work would think that's a very, very important resource for us to work with. And more people here in Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, if you prefer, would start to take clients and people out in nature. And I think that's really critical, because there's many young people, as we know, in the community here who they are carrying the impacts of transgenerational trauma. And we owe it to them to give them the rituals and to give them the skills and the embodied experiences to transform that trauma. And you know, they are increasingly in the community. Now we're developing more sophisticated skills for handling trauma healing and indeed reconciliation, and seeing the links between the two of them. But I want to also put it into the broader context of the earth as well, so it will include that level, because we absolutely depend on that. Can I have the next slide, please? I don't have the button, so I'm relying on others. Can someone move it on? Thank you. Okay, so in terms of the qualities that I feel are vital that we need to develop if you're a practitioner in the field, and I think this work by internal family systems is really useful in terms of what do we need when we're working with trauma healing and reconciliation. And it's called self-leadership. And if you just look at them, even the words, I feel they have a resonance, and I hope you can feel them, that they're, when you look at them, they actually have an effect. Because when we hear words like genocide or trauma, those the language does have some effect, especially if we're sensitive, which we need to be if we're working in the fields. We need to stay sensitive. So these indicators of when we're really in resilience, we could say, are the qualities of calm and curious, clear and compassionate, confident and creative, courageous and connected. And I wonder, how does that feel if you just let that resonate in your own body? Do you recognize those qualities within yourself, so that they are like the healing, the trauma healing qualities, or the capacities that we can engage in reconciliation work, both doing our inner work and also with others, as well as looking at what a supervisor is a well-known person for training supervisors in England. He would call it inner pollution, the kind of I don't know that I like the term pollution, but it's like those residues of trauma that we all carry, some residues of that to a greater extent. And I totally take Karen's point that we're not all in the same boat. So I absolutely get that. But these kinds of qualities and how they can get undermined actually when we're working in the fields. And I love that Karen talked about how people can become self-sacrificing when they're in this kind of work. And in fact, our culture here can be quite like that, although it's changing. But certainly I do remember during times when things were really, the violence was still going on here, that people naturally wanted to make sacrifices for others. But that can also become a kind of habit, which is, it can be very hurtful. So there's a way of, I feel, in terms of well-being and looking after ourselves is absolutely critical in the field. Now, I don't know what kind of work all yourselves are doing, but I presume you're in some way engaged in this area. So I'm just curious about that. So kind of the next slide, please. So three of the, I will talk about some of my work, by the way, in different countries, but I do want to give you some takeaways on this. It's a bit funny for me because I can't control the machine as well. So, and it's lovely actually having the support of someone else doing it. But I kind of thought, what would be the three kind of takeaways? And my daughter told me to do this. She said, Mum, if you're doing a presentation, you have to give 3 takeaways. So I'm giving the 3 takeaways, and then I will go back into some experiences of working maybe in Sri Lanka, which would give an example. I have worked a lot here as well, but on front lines with young people and adults who have been suicidal, self-harming, and in special needs. And so in community contexts as well as privately. So I'm an independent practitioner as well as having worked in the community for a long time. But I want to put these up. When I'm thinking of trauma healing and reconciliation, I think the first point that we really need to look at is we need to really look at the context and the field of that and be sensitive to that. And as Karen also said, to be non-pathologizing and taking a relational and trauma-informed approach. And I love the way she unpacked that. So it does need to have human rights and equality so that each of us can be safer and freer from our own survival defaults. And in a way, we'll get a sense of that when we know what we do, when we're really, when we've had an obvious traumatic experience, or the patterns that we get into as a result of our traumatic experience. For example, a pattern whereby we might get into relationships, be in relationship dynamics. And I think that is something that everyone in it deserves to heal from. Where, as we talked, as Christophe talked in Rwanda, the perpetrator survivor, you know, what happens after someone has had a traumatic experience and they're still in that dynamic internally. It's like supporting people to come out of these defaults, and also of, obviously, you wonder how we would stop the likes of Putin at the minute, but it's obvious that he is a traumatized man. And I think the work that we're doing is absolutely critical, both locally and internationally, to bring more awareness so that we are really getting the capacity to shift these patterns of individual and collective trauma. And I think one of the ways we can do that is really taking care of our own agency and limits and having very active practices in that, which one word I call that is everyday Camino. You know, and I did do the Camino myself and found it really amazing, you know, where you can walk in Spain or in Portugal. And I know in parts of this island, there's walks that, and there's the Ulster Way. But that kind of practice of walking and, but whatever it is we do for our own well-being, developing the culture that is really nourishing well-being and being trauma-informed so that each and every day, in a sense, we are actually doing something on that. So in terms of how I would see trauma healing and reconciliation, I have been involved, as I said, in many different pieces of work around that. And one would be a piece of work with Burrows a long time ago, called We'll Never Be the Same, and it was with parents after traumatic events in 2 of our communities here in 2002. And basically that work, along with the work of many other people, helped bring to awareness transgenerational trauma, which was not, it hadn't really been recognized by government at that time. And that piece of work was really about recording the experiences of parents and coming in and stepping up with what skills did they need. And at that time as a practitioner, I was still learning what skills I needed myself and developing, you know, reaching out to the Netherlands and actually learning somatic experience and skills, which we brought back here. So some of us in Gestalt Centre Belfast would have done that at the time. And in a way, it's like an absolute human right, really, that people have those. Like everyone, I strongly believe, has a right to have access to that and for that to be as widely available as possible. And I think one of the upsides of the community here is I feel we are pretty strong on community and community resources. Of course, it can always be better, but there's something absolutely vital about having that. And I do feel part of a movement of people who have brought that in. Also, there's many other ways to highlight issues around trauma healing and reconciliation, which of course are 2 different things and they don't need to be brought together. And for some people, you know, some people do not necessarily, they're not in a position yet to feel that they want to reconcile. Meanwhile, others, you know, they've been in that all along, you know, in terms of the differences in the community here. So can I have the next slide, please? Now, I'm putting this up because I feel it's absolutely critical to see the people working in the field of trauma healing and reconciliation as the immune system of communities, and that they need supported, because unfortunately, even some of our organizations working with trauma, they end up carrying impacts that whereby people within those organizations can act out dynamics with each other. So part of the, I suppose, both the trauma healing bit as well as the reconciliation piece, I feel, is to really support people doing this kind of work, because it's utterly invaluable work, and you know the community relies on it. So in the bit, you know, I think something I've learned personally from being involved in the work here is that our history is not our destiny. And when we can really feel that and find ways to transform that, that is so empowering, and that we can actually, with the right support and with sufficient resources, overcome the individual and collective imprints of trauma, and we can heal from that. And I would love to see everyone with that possibility and access and services. One of the countries that I have worked in as well has been in Sri Lanka. And it was after the war there where people were training in an embodied approach to releasing the war trauma that there'd been in Sri Lanka. And there were a group of mainly Tamil young people, along with some Sinhalese Buddhist people who were also in the big trauma healing group. There was about 50 people, and I was part of an international team that was working with that group. And what was so moving was how the young people were helping people within their own community. For example, young people who had come back, who had been conscripted to be soldiers in that particular war, and they'd come back disabled. And the young people then trained in counselling skills, and then they did an additional layer of embodied training, which we were over teaching them. You know, how you can release trauma from the body and through the nervous system, and then get more emotional regulation, and how those young people were helping the young, mainly young men who had come back with disabilities, to stay alive so that they could regulate their body. And it was so moving to be part of that work, as well as working here, of course, and being committed to the work here. Can I have the next slide? Or just, well, that one there, I'm actually putting that in because I feel that we need to extend the field of trauma healing and reconciliation into including our relationship with nature, and to see it as a period that, in a way, I do see that it's down to trauma healing and reconciliation as to whether we will survive as a species. It's that kind of stark, and we do have that facing us. So there's something about when you're involved in this field of work to really to remember that. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, we'll leave that one. We'll leave that one. That's just my final slide. But I want to go back just to say a little bit more about, I suppose, how much it means for me, this particular field of work. I think most of us who come into it, we come into it because we've needed to do so for ourselves. So to be able to come in and engage and not only find some healing for ourselves, as well as being active in peace building work and human rights work, and to be able to see, to actually be part of supporting other people to have positive changes in their lives and to heal from some of the traumas they've been through. It is such an honor and a necessity, of course. So I do want to say that, history is not destiny. And I think what we do can make all the difference. So I want to kind of finish with a poem actually that I wrote, especially for this event. Trauma healing and reconciliation's an ongoing improvisation, inside out and outside in. Sometimes we regress, make a bit of a mess. We cannot expect the A to Z. Sometimes it's A to B, some days A to F, a constant renegotiation within you and me. We need our big self that can do this work. A competent protector, as they call it in IFS work, a compassionate witness, an adult overseer, an inner sat-nav, a GPS, so that we can safely unblend and uncouple dynamics like perpetrator, victim, or bystander, all the wounded child, the parent, all the different aspects of self, and reconnect our own inner biodiversity, our tribal council. Sometimes we step in and risk. We get hurt and injured with the other. Sometimes we need to step out, restore, renew, and recycle, love ourselves and each other. So that is me for now. I actually did have a loss myself a few days ago, so I'm still in a process with that. And I actually think each of us has to turn up and know that it's okay just to be the way we are.
Yes, yes. Rosie, thank you so much for a very self-aware and honest contribution, and for unlocking so much that is within ourselves by just making us aware of it. And I thought your list of C's, the list of C's was a really interesting checklist, because there were a lot of things in there that perhaps we aren't tuned into, we don't recognize within ourselves. And what I took from what you said was that it'd be good if we could recognize those things within ourselves and allow them to be within ourselves. Yes. And it's that wise and discerning mentor that lives within us to be able to allow that to be, as well as the hurt person, and so that we can travel onwards. So thank you very much indeed. That was quite lovely, actually. I really liked your opening reference to John O'Donoghue, and in a few moments I'll stick up a slide with John's website on it. And if you're not aware, if our participants aren't aware of John O'Donoghue, it's a wonderful example of how religious language has been brought into the 21st century for us to use, even in a non-religious way, although we can use it in a religious way as well. And it goes back to the points that Christophe was making actually about that. I liked your idea of journeying through trauma as a constant improvisation. You mentioned that in your poem, and would you say a bit more about that? What does that mean that we're improvising on our way through trauma?
Yeah, well, it's a dynamic, and according to what is going on in our life at the time, or how much pressure we're under, we are going to feel this embodied response to that. You know, we might feel ourselves tired, we might have patterns of exhaustion, or whatever it is that we might recognize might be a residue of some personal trauma. So the improvisation to me is every day we're kind of improvising around what is going to keep us from kind of going down more into trauma. You could call it reenactment with each other, which I think happens a lot in the community, that people are still polarizing, you know, because they're in the trauma reenactment. They haven't embedded enough of the trauma healing yet. In some communities, that especially maybe those with less resources, generally, although of course that can happen at the highest levels of power as well. But this kind of orientation into the present, so that we come back, these practices really that I'm calling everyday Camino or relational resilience, it mean we're coming back and we're regulating ourselves and our own breath, so that we're not getting big peaks and troughs of what we know are trauma symptoms of hyperarousal or hypo, and we're able to stay on a range that's comfortable for ourselves and also emotionally. And then we feel pretty resilient.
Yes.
It might even move to thriving if we're lucky.
Yes, but don't get carried away now.
Oh, I like getting carried away.
That's lovely. You talked about our culture was changing, and you said in here in Northern Ireland we are changing, and I would like to know what you think about that. How are we changing, and how are we changing for good, and how are we changing for the not so good?
Yeah, well, I'll give an example of where I live, which is kind of Upper Ormeau, and I do see that as a wee beacon of light. I'm a bit biased, of course, you know, but there's a lot of diversity in Ormeau area. And it seems to me there's a lot of people being able to live alongside each other and connect and be creative. And there's different initiatives coming out. So I would see certain parts of the community here, they're like havens or sanctuaries, where you're getting more diversity and more expansion rather than the restriction that happens with trauma. So you can see it at a community level. And then, of course, you can see other areas that are more, well, there's diversity everywhere. I don't even want to generalize, but
Yes.
you know, it's you can see where there's more life coming in, more diversity. I think one of the indicators of trauma healing is more life, more creativity, people participating in the arts. You know,
Yes.
people who wouldn't have had a voice then getting a voice, like
Yes.
my bad poem. You know,
Yes,
I
yes,
think
indeed.
we're great for the arts here, actually, and that they're a very important cultural resource.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, and Ormo is a part of Belfast, South Belfast, isn't that correct?
Yeah.
Yes. But there's a friend of mine who made a recent application for a grant, and he part of our grant giving tradition in the last 20, 30 years within Northern Ireland has involved a bit of a head count on who's Catholic or nationalist and who's Protestant Unionist. And he said to the funder, he says, we're not doing Catholics or Protestants. We don't do that around here. And I thought that was a very refreshing and like a liberating approach. And the funder said, "Oh, okay, all right,
yes,
that's all right then." So you know, you're quite right. There are signs and there are glimmers of hope along the way, and we make them ourselves. Of course, I think COVID has taught us, you know, that the essential relationships are with our family, our neighbours, our friends, for those in need. And now with Ukraine, we can find a new constellation of people that we need to support in one way or another. Yes.
Yeah, and to include the whole diversity in the new communities that are here, and just
Yes.
broaden that so that we move away from almost sectarianism as institutionalized.
Indeed.
What Karen was saying about
Yes.
it becomes institutionalized.
Yes.
Shift from that and get an awareness of the many ways that people identify, including what was the Star Wars one as the fourth force?
Yes,
something like that. It was, I think, a third or something of the population here at one point actually identified outside the two main communities, which I think is a sign of that capacity to embrace change and reconciliation in different ways and different ways of identifying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, time has beat us, Rosie. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. And it's been most interesting to hear you. And on another occasion, maybe we'll hear more. So thank you again for such a heartwarming presentation. And I'm going to just conclude now with a few thoughts, just to share this with you, if you don't mind. Let me just go back to the start of this one here. Where's this gone? Sorry about this. Right, here we go. Right, there we go. I hope everybody can see that okay. Just to say to you that a few thoughts in conclusion. Really, as I thought about the theme, I thought I'd put together some thoughts and some ways we could bring some of these themes together of trauma and reconciliation. How do we actually make these things work? And we've heard real live examples of that today, and it's been very enriching and very informative really about this. But I wanted to first of all say thank you to everybody for today. I want to thank you, the participants, for joining us today and making today meaningful. And we hope that you've benefited from it, and certainly would love to have some feedback from you in due course, to hear what your thoughts are. And indeed, I suppose, just if you've got other ideas about other webinars on these themes that you might like us to arrange, then do let us know. I want to thank our speakers, Karen, Christophe and Rosie, for three very different but highly complementary presentations that fit together like pieces of a jigsaw and speak to each other. So thank you very much for that. Cooperation in Ireland and partners were responsible for putting this event together, and I'm very grateful to them and express our collective thanks to them for making this possible. And I'm grateful too for the invitation to be part of it all and to hear from some excellent speakers. The funding body that has underpinned this is the Special European Programme Body based here in Ireland, North and South. And so our thanks to the funders and to ABC Productions for the technical support along the way. Rosie mentioned John O'Donoghue, and I thought it'd be worthwhile just flagging up his website. Lots of useful material there. interviews with him and so on, but also his books. And if you wanted to find out more about him, very special man, sadly no longer with us, but a wonderful writer. This is a picture taken a week after the Omagh bombing in 1998, when people gathered to offer their support and to lend their outrage, I suppose, at what had happened just a week earlier. And this photograph, for me, is always a very emotional photograph, because this is about a community that has experienced a trauma, but also a community that is coming out in protest, in support, and in lament for what has happened. I always find it very striking when I look across the faces in this, that it's hard to find one where there's a smile on the face, the very solemn faces. And of course, on this day, many people joined us by television from all across the world. And there is something about community as being part of the experience of trauma, and we've heard of that in different ways from our three speakers, about this sense of context, also about community giving meaning sometimes to trauma, and also being a resource and a means and a pathway by which we can experience recovery. I wanted to share just a little bit of some of the research that we did in Omagh after the Omagh bombing. This study looks at the post-traumatic stress scores and the general health scores for a very large sample of people who took part in the community study of adults who've been from the Omagh community. And basically what this tells us is that being on the street where the bomb exploded, or being a witness, or suffering loss, were differentially associated with levels of stress and ill health linked to the experience. Now, I think this goes without saying. I don't think many of us would be greatly surprised at this, but it obviously is important to register that it doesn't really help for us to talk about a traumatized community in the context of Northern Ireland, for example, but rather to think about those who have been directly involved in one way or another in the implications, or in the violence that's been associated with the Troubles. This is quite an important slide, again, locally, but also I suspect internationally as well. It was another study that we had done with the University of Ulster, with a very, very fine research team based in Magee. What we found was that in this large group of participants of over 4,000 people, there was a group that had never experienced a trauma in their life. There were some who had experienced traumas, but not ones that were linked to the Troubles. And then there was a third group that had experienced Troubles and possibly other traumas as well. This was the group who had never experienced a trauma in their life, and this was the level of mental illness amongst that group. When we add in those that had no conflict trauma, then you can begin to see that traumatic experiences are associated with higher levels of mental ill health. And when we add in the impact of the Troubles, conflict-related traumas, then that becomes even more stark. So this means probably that trauma isn't terribly good for your health. And so it is something about which we need to be properly concerned. And this is one of the ways in which we can look at the implications of traumatic experiences, that is through the impact on mental health and well-being. This chart looks a bit busy, and I'll try and explain it very quickly, but what the blue line represents those who developed mood disorders, or what we might call depression. And what we found was that about half of those, that's where the 50% line is running across the middle of the chart, about half of those who had experience of depression sought help within the first year of the onset of symptoms. If we look at addiction disorders, which is the green chart, then it was roughly about 12 to 15 years before half of those who'd developed these disorders sought help. And then those with anxiety disorders, which are very common after traumatic experiences. And we think there about panic disorder, OCD, post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. It took as long as 22 years for half that group. And if you think about any incident associated with any of our tragedies collectively across the world, and you add on 22 years, what you're saying there is that theoretically only half of those who have suffered as a consequence of that experience have sought help, and there's another half beyond that. So we're in this for the long haul. Now, some of that research is available and described in the book that I wrote, forgive me for being slightly self-promoting here, but I thought I would try and do a deal with our publisher for you, and they've offered a 30% discount if you use that code conference30 when you go onto the Manchester University Press website and look for the book. And the paperback edition comes in at about $14.99 sterling, and you get a 30% discount on that if you use that code within the next few weeks. This is another piece of research that we've done again with the University of Ulster, and this looked at the transgenerational dynamics, really, how events in the life of the child after the trauma has been experienced by a parent can go on to then become a problem for the youngster, the growing and developing child, and the young adult. Now, I'm not going to go through this now because it's rather time consuming and complicated, but basically what this circle describes a journey with accumulating opportunities, but also risks along the way. Now, that research is described in a publication published by the Commission for Victims and Survivors. And if you go onto their website, what's happened here now? This will move. Sorry. Sorry about this. There we go. Right. Yes, there it's described in that publication, Towards a Better Future, which is available to download from the Commission for Victims and Survivors. CVSNI.org. If you do a search in that, you'll find it under the research heading within their website. How do we bring all these ideas together? This is something that I worked on in the around the year 1999-2000. I suppose in the wake of the Omagh bombing, which happened in 1998, as I began to try and wrestle with these things. And I suppose people within a context of community conflict and civil conflict, which we had here in Northern Ireland, could arguably be at one extreme or another. One extreme where they feel they're not recognized, where they're not remembered, where they're not forgotten, or sorry, where they are forgotten. And when Christophe was speaking, I thought about this in some respects. And then at the other extreme is the place where people are recognized, remembered, and acknowledged. Obviously, it's, in theory anyway, highly desirable that we move everybody to the upper part of this chart. We also then have to think about people who are disabled by hurt and loss, and those that are at the other extreme, enabled to live fulfilled lives. And again, our desire is to move people across to the right-hand side of this chart. So what does it take to move people from not being recognized to being recognized? Well, there are obviously a whole range of mechanisms, and we've just mentioned a few of them here. One is justice, economics, equality, retraining. And again, our speakers mentioned other ones, human rights being another mechanism by which we can move in this direction as well. And then on the therapeutic restorative mechanisms, they can help people move from being disabled by hurt and loss to being able to live fulfilled lives in some way. And if we put these two together, we get this kind of structure where we're trying to move everybody into the top right-hand corner of this chart, where people are stakeholders, they have reclaimed their lives, they have some hope of the future, and identified enriched parts of their lives as well. And we could add a whole lot of other things to that to give it meaning and relevance to any particular context or family or individual. And so what the point of this diagram is to make the point is that it's not just one mechanism or one set of responses that will actually bring the healing and restoration that our community so badly needs. A friend of mine, Elizabeth Capewell, whom I've known really since 1987, had been involved in, after the Hungerford shootings in the south of England way back in 1987. And subsequently, she worked in a lot of areas, and particularly in education, around a number of tragedies. And she then suffered the traumatic death of her daughter. And it was out of particularly the death of her daughter that she put this chart together, which for me has always been a very enabling and revealing chart. And what she talks about is, if you top left-hand corner there, where we have the old world, or the old world in which we lived before the trauma happened. And I think it was Rosie said that, you know, there was a program where we're working with a group of families where things would never be the same again. And that is indeed true, that traumatic events in our lives can mark the before and after of our lives. So Elizabeth talks about the old world view, and and then we move through the traumatic experience and have to go on a journey, one that we would not have chosen. And that journey is at the beginning full of turbulence, and Elizabeth calls this chaos, where there's a vacuum. And that vacuum is filled by shock and fear, anger, overactivity, and a whole lot of other helpful and unhelpful responses. And I was interested in Rosie's talk of survival defaults. This is perhaps where we develop the survival defaults, some of which can help us in the short term, but aren't necessarily good for us in the long term. And alcohol, for example, is a case in point. People will rely on alcohol to ease the pain, but then the alcohol becomes the problem. And that's the point at which we then enter into the self-destructive period, where things can go really badly wrong for us. And Elizabeth says it's at this place that we have choices to make about what we're going to do with what we're carrying. And we can stay in this place, or we can make decisions to move on. And when we ran our trauma centers in Omaha, it was so many times that we saw people at this moment in their lives who made the choice, I'm going to do something about this, and sought help from us. And or often it was a family member saying, unless you do something about this, you know, there will be consequences. I'm going to leave, or whatever. I can't take this anymore. Then, having negotiated this very difficult part of the journey, and Elizabeth describes the gifts, which she says were acceptance of what has happened, the aspiration to forgive, which I think is a very interesting phrase, particularly looking back at Christophe's presentation. We may not feel we can forgive, but we might feel within us the hope of being able to forgive, and that in itself is a step along the road. And then there's that thing about letting go of the trauma, that there are other things in my life which I need to pay attention to, as well as this terrible experience. She then talked about the new energy, the creativity, and then entering into something that looks like a new world where everything is much more in harmony again and more balanced. And this is where we experience restoration and indeed growth. For me, that's always been a very helpful way of looking at this. And indeed, within this cycle, there's hope. And for me, having hope of a journey through trauma is as important as anything. I wanted to leave you all with this picture, a picture of a parent with a child on a mountaintop, the child being uplifted and held. It's actually my granddaughter and her daddy. And for me, this is a picture of fun, of hope, of exhilaration, of buoyancy, and of love. And we've been dealing with a tough subject today, and I think we've been helped to think about it in a safe and enabling way by our three speakers. But before we go our separate ways, I wanted to leave you with the thought that after this ends, let's embrace the fun in our lives, the love in our lives, and look forward to a lovely day for the rest of the day and a lovely weekend. And so with that, thank you everybody for your contribution to this, and we wish you all the very best.